When I moved into Maplewood Estates, I thought I'd found the perfect place to raise a family. The neighborhood looked like something out of a magazine: manicured lawns, rows of tidy houses, and an air of calm that seemed almost unreal. My backyard opened into a stretch of open grass where the neighborhood kids played tag until the sun dipped low. Felt like a dream, a safe community, a place where childhood could bloom unbothered. But every dream has its shadows. Mine came in the form of a woman named Marjorie. Most people called her Marge, though she preferred Mrs. Ellison. And she lived 2 houses down, behind a trimmed hedge and a watchful gaze. You could see her curtains shift whenever anyone walked by. She was the type of neighbor who noticed the color of your mailbox flag or how long your garbage bins sat at the curb. The type who believed rules were sacred, and her interpretation of them even more so. It started small, almost unnoticeable at first. One afternoon, as my 7-year-old son kicked a ball across our shared strip of grass, I caught her standing with arms folded, lips pursed. I thought little of it. Maybe she was just watching. But then came the scowls, the pointed glares, the exaggerated sighs when kids ran past her driveway. It didn't take long to realize she wasn't just observing. She was taking inventory of everything she disapproved of. The first complaint arrived in the form of a neatly folded letter in my mailbox. No greeting, no name, just a typed note telling me children must be supervised at all times, and unsightly toys should not be left outside. I laughed it off, figuring it was some overzealous neighbor who misunderstood what a community was supposed to feel like. Kids laugh, kids play, that's life. But Marjorie didn't see it that way. Soon she was on her porch every afternoon, glaring at the kids as if their laughter were an attack. She claimed they were trampling her flowers, though her flower beds were behind a fence no child could reach. She said their games were excessively noisy, even though their shouts were no louder than a passing lawnmower. Her voice, however, was plenty loud whenever she felt compelled to yell across the street. Then came the threat. One evening, as parents gathered to pick up their children from an impromptu soccer game, Marjorie marched over with a clipboard. Her tone was sharp, her words colder than the fall breeze. She announced that if the children continued playing outside, she would call the HOA and have it handled. The way she said handled carried a weight, a promise of trouble. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe she was just bluffing. But over the next week, things escalated. I saw her snapping photos of bicycles leaned against fences. I heard her shouting at kids who weren't even mine. And when a letter from the Homeowners Association appeared, citing excessive outdoor play creating disturbance, I knew exactly who was behind it. The other parents were frustrated but hesitant. Nobody wanted to make waves. This was Marjorie Ellison, after all, longtime resident, self-appointed keeper of the community standards. People whispered that she had friends on the HOA board. The message was clear: cross her at your own risk. But I've never been one to back down when someone tries to bully children, especially mine. If she wanted to make outdoor play a battleground, fine. I'd meet her there. As the sun set on another tense afternoon, I stood in my backyard, staring at that wide patch of grass that once felt so free. I thought about my son's face when Marjorie barked at him to keep it down. I thought about the way the neighborhood kids now played in nervous whispers, glancing at her windows like they expected a guard to pop out. And that's when the idea hit me. If she wanted to stop the kids from playing outside, I'd give them more reason to play than ever before. Not just a few toys, not just a ball or two, something bigger, something impossible to ignore, something that would turn my yard into the one place in the neighborhood where childhood ruled supreme. I pulled out my phone and started making calls. If Marjorie was ready to declare war, she had no idea who she was messing with. The quiet suburban peace had cracked, and I was about to shatter it completely. The next chapter will tell how I set my plan in motion, step by step, knowing full well Marjorie would be watching. The morning after Marjorie's threat, the air in Maplewood Estates felt different. The street was quieter than usual, as though the kids sensed that something had shifted. Normally, laughter would float across the cul-de-sac, but now it was as though the neighborhood had fallen under some invisible curfew. Parents who once waved cheerfully now looked around nervously, as though they expected to see Marjorie lurking behind her curtains with that ever-present clipboard. I, however, felt energized. If she thought a letter from the HOA would scare me, she clearly underestimated just how stubborn I could be. I wasn't about to let a single neighbor decide that children couldn't enjoy their own yards. So, while the rest of the community held its breath, I spent the day making phone calls and sketching out plans at my kitchen table. The first step was research. I needed to find something big. Not just a swing set or a plastic slide, but something that would turn my yard into the ultimate play space. I scrolled through catalogs of playground equipment, from modest backyard sets to full-blown commercial installations. The more I looked, the bigger my idea grew. Why settle for small when I could go massive? Why just make my yard fun when I could make it unforgettable? By mid-afternoon, I had contacted a company that specialized in installing playground structures. They usually worked with schools and parks, not private homes, which only made the idea sweeter. I arranged for a consultation that very evening, making sure they understood exactly what I wanted. Something colorful, tall, and impossible to ignore. Something that would make kids squeal with excitement and, inevitably, make Marjorie's blood pressure spike. While waiting for them to arrive, I surveyed my backyard. It was a decent size, but I'd need to rearrange things to make room for what I had in mind. The vegetable garden would have to move. The old shed, too. But I didn't mind. This wasn't just about defying Marjorie. It was about restoring something she had tried to take away, the joy and freedom of childhood. When the installation team pulled into the driveway, I could feel the curtain twitch from 2 doors down. Marjorie was watching already. I greeted the workers, walked them through the yard, and showed them the spot where I wanted everything placed. We stood there for nearly an hour, measuring, planning, and discussing how to make this happen as quickly as possible. They promised to start by the end of the week. Of course, in a neighborhood like this, nothing stayed secret for long. By the next morning, whispers had begun. I caught 2 parents talking on the sidewalk, glancing at my house with curious expressions. They'd seen the contractor's truck and wanted to know what I was planning. I didn't tell them much. Not because I didn't trust them, but because I wanted it to be a surprise. The fewer details out there, the better. Marjorie, however, was less patient. That afternoon, I found her standing near my property line, pretending to inspect her hedge. It was obvious she wanted to confront me, to pry into what I was doing. I simply smiled, waved, and went back inside. I could practically feel her frustration radiating through the air. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. I cleared out my backyard, hauled old planters to the curb, and rented a storage unit for the things that had to go. Each trip back and forth, I imagined Marjorie peering out from her window, scribbling notes for her next HOA complaint. If she thought she'd seen the worst of it, she had no idea what was coming. Finally, installation day arrived. At sunrise, a flatbed truck rolled into the neighborhood carrying massive sections of steel and plastic. Brightly colored slides, platforms, and climbing walls gleamed in the morning light. The sound of drills and hammers filled the air as the crew got to work assembling the structure piece by piece. Neighbors began to gather, watching the spectacle unfold. Children on bicycles circled the edge of my driveway, their eyes wide with wonder. The parents whispered among themselves, some amused, others concerned about what the HOA might say. And through it all, Marjorie stood at her window like a sentinel, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin, furious line. By late afternoon, the playground was taking shape. A towering slide twisted in bright red and yellow arcs, a climbing net stretched between sturdy posts, and 2 swings hung from a reinforced frame. It was far bigger than anything a typical backyard would hold, which, of course, was the entire point. The kids couldn't resist. Even before the workers were finished, they hovered close, eager to climb and swing. I told them they had to wait until everything was secure, but I could see the excitement bubbling over. Their laughter was louder than it had been in weeks, filling the street with the kind of joy Marjorie hated most. As the sun dipped low, the crew packed up their tools and promised to return the next day to finish the final touches. I stood in the middle of my yard, looking up at what we'd built, feeling a rush of pride. This wasn't just a playground, it was a statement. a reminder that no one neighbor could control an entire community. But I also knew this was only the beginning. Marjorie wasn't the type to back down quietly. If anything, this would provoke her into action. And judging by the way she marched across her lawn that evening, phone in hand, I had a feeling the HOA was about to hear from her again. The battle lines were drawn, and Marjorie was preparing her counterattack. In the next chapter, her complaints would escalate, and the HOA would try to step in. The morning after the playground frame went up, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, but I had a good idea of who was on the other end, or at least who had prompted the call. Sure enough, it was a representative from the Homeowners Association. Their voice was polite, but their message was unmistakable. There had been complaints about unauthorized construction and community disturbances. They wanted me to pause any ongoing work until the matter could be reviewed. I could practically hear Marjorie whispering those exact words to them the night before. She had wasted no time. I wasn't surprised. If there's one thing people like Marjorie know how to do, it's weaponize the HOA. She knew all the bylaws by heart, and she wielded them like a sword. What she hadn't counted on was that I had done my homework too. Before I even broke ground, I'd scoured the community guidelines line by line. Nowhere did it say playground equipment was prohibited. There were rules about permanent structures, fences, and sheds, but nothing against something designed for children to play on. I was well within my rights, and she hated that more than anything. Still, I knew the call wasn't an idle warning. The HOA had real power. If they decided to push the issue, they could fine me or drag me into a drawn-out dispute. I couldn't let that happen. So while the workers returned to finish assembling the playground, I gathered every document I could find. Property surveys, HOA bylaws, even email receipts proving I'd followed every guideline for exterior modifications. By midday, the street was alive with activity again. The towering slide gleamed in the sun, swings hung steady from their chains, and a climbing wall went up piece by piece. Children gathered at the edge of my yard, watching as their future hangout took shape. Their excitement was contagious. You could almost feel the neighborhood waking up again, shaking off the tension Marjorie had tried to spread. But just as the laughter returned, so did the storm. Marjorie appeared on her porch with her ever-present clipboard, phone pressed to her ear. She paced back and forth, gesturing sharply toward my yard, her voice rising loud enough for half the street to hear. Not long after, another HOA letter appeared in my mailbox. This one more formal, accusing me of creating a public nuisance and warning of potential penalties. It was classic intimidation, the kind of letter designed to scare homeowners into submission. But instead of shrinking back, I doubled down. I typed a calm, thorough response, attaching every relevant document, every line of the bylaws showing I was in compliance. I even CC'd several other neighbors who had expressed support, making sure the HOA knew I wasn't fighting this battle alone. As I worked, I could feel the atmosphere shifting again. Parents who had been afraid to let their kids play outside started to smile when they walked by. A few even offered to help pay for the playground, though I politely refused. This wasn't about money. It was about sending a message. No one, not even Marjorie with her HOA connections, had the right to steal childhood from a community. By late afternoon, the playground was complete. The final bolts were tightened, the safety checks finished, and the crew packed up their tools. What stood in my backyard now was nothing short of magnificent. A full-scale play fortress with slides, swings, climbing nets, and even a little tower with a bridge. You could see it from the street, and there was no missing it. The kids didn't need an invitation. As soon as I gave the nod, they poured in like water breaking through a dam. Laughter rang out as they raced to the swings, scrambled up the climbing wall, and zipped down the slide. Their joy was pure, unfiltered, the kind of sound that made a neighborhood feel alive. And, predictably, Marjorie snapped. She stormed across her yard, shouting about noise and rules, threatening to have it all torn down. Parents stood by, watching as she ranted, their expressions a mix of shock and growing defiance. For weeks, she had ruled the street through fear and intimidation, but now the balance was shifting. People were no longer whispering. They were openly rolling their eyes. That evening, I received another call from the HOA. This time, their tone was less friendly. They claimed they were scheduling an emergency board meeting to discuss unauthorized alterations, and that I would need to attend. I agreed without hesitation. If they wanted a fight, I was ready to give them one, and I wasn't going alone. As the sun set, I stood in my yard watching the last few kids head home, their faces glowing with excitement. Parents thanked me quietly, some even shaking my hand. It was clear I wasn't just building a playground. I was building unity. Marjorie wanted to divide the neighborhood, to make everyone afraid of her complaints and connections. But instead, she was bringing people together, just not in the way she'd intended. I knew the real showdown was coming. The HOA board meeting would decide whether this playground stayed or went. Marjorie would be there, no doubt with her clipboard and a stack of exaggerated complaints. But I wouldn't be walking in alone. I had the rules on my side, and now I had the neighborhood too. The playground was finished, but the war was far from over. In the next chapter, the HOA meeting begins, and the battle lines are drawn face to face. The HOA scheduled the emergency meeting for Thursday evening, and word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. It wasn't just another dull agenda about landscaping or garbage pickup. This was about the playground, my playground, and everyone knew it. For days, I could feel the tension in the air. Neighbors exchanged glances at mailboxes, whispered across driveways, and peeked through curtains to see who was siding with whom. Marjorie was relentless in the build-up. Every morning, she strutted around the cul-de-sac like a general preparing for war, phone in hand, clipboard tucked under her arm. I could only imagine the barrage of emails she sent to the HOA board, each one dripping with self-righteous fury. She probably included grainy zoomed-in photos of kids on swings, exaggerated claims about noise levels, and dire warnings about property values plummeting into oblivion because of unsanctioned structures. The day of the meeting, I felt a mix of nerves and determination. I wasn't someone who liked confrontation, but this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every kid who deserved to laugh and play without feeling like a criminal. It was about every parent who shouldn't have to live under the shadow of a neighbor's clipboard tyranny. The meeting was held in the community center, a beige building with fluorescent lights that hummed like mosquitoes. When I walked in, I wasn't surprised to find Marjorie already there, seated at the front like she owned the place. Her posture was perfect, her chin tilted upward, and that clipboard rested in her lap like a badge of honor. Around her, the HOA board members shuffled papers and whispered among themselves, their expressions cautious but curious. Then I noticed something that made my chest swell with quiet pride. I wasn't alone. Behind me, neighbors began to file in, parents, kids clutching stuffed animals, even a few retirees who normally stayed out of drama. They filled the rows of plastic chairs, their presence speaking louder than any argument. This wasn't just a meeting anymore. It was a community deciding what kind of neighborhood it wanted to be. The chairperson called the meeting to order, and Marjorie wasted no time launching into her tirade. Her voice was sharp, echoing through the sterile room as she painted a picture of chaos and disorder. She claimed the playground was a safety hazard, an unauthorized structure, and a public nuisance. She spoke of screaming children shattering the peace, of strangers supposedly wandering in, drawn by the amusement park I had built. As she talked, I studied the faces in the crowd. Some looked uncomfortable, others skeptical, and a few outright annoyed. Her words were polished, but they dripped with the same venom everyone had felt in her glares and letters. When she finally finished, after what felt like an eternity, the chairperson turned to me and asked for my response. I stood, heart pounding but voice steady. I didn't shout. I didn't throw insults. Instead, I laid out the facts, calm and clear. I explained that I had reviewed every HOA guideline before moving forward, that the playground was temporary and fully compliant. I provided copies of the bylaws, highlighting the sections that supported my case. Then, I spoke about why I did it. Not to provoke, not to flaunt the rules, but to give the kids a place to play, to bring life back to a neighborhood that had grown tense and joyless. I reminded them of what community truly meant. It wasn't about rigid control or silencing laughter. It was about families feeling safe and connected. I pointed to the parents sitting behind me, their children quiet but wide-eyed, clutching the hope that their playground would survive this battle. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then, something unexpected happened. The neighbors began to speak. One by one, they stood and shared their own frustrations with the complaints, their own support for the playground. A father talked about how his son had been too scared to ride his bike after Marjorie yelled at him. A mother admitted she almost sold her house because of the constant scrutiny. Even a retired couple, who had no children, said the sound of kids playing made the neighborhood feel alive. It was like a dam breaking. All the resentment, all the tension that had been simmering under the surface spilled out. Not toward me, but toward Marjorie and the culture of fear she had created. She sat stiffly, her face tightening with every word. But for once, she had no control of the narrative. The board members exchanged glances, clearly sensing which way the wind was blowing. They huddled for a few minutes, voices low, then announced their decision. The playground could stay. It was not in violation of any rules, and as long as it met safety standards, the HOA had no grounds to demand its removal. The room erupted in quiet cheers and relieved sighs. Parents smiled, kids whispered excitedly, and I felt the weight of weeks of tension lift from my shoulders. The battle was over, at least officially. But as I gathered my papers and turned toward the door, I caught Marjorie's gaze. Her eyes burned with silent fury, and I knew this wasn't the last move she would make. People like her didn't lose gracefully. Outside, the evening air felt crisp and cool, and the neighborhood buzzed with energy. Parents thanked me. Kids tugged at their sleeves, begging to play as soon as they got home. And for the first time in weeks, Maplewood Estates felt like a community again. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Marjorie was already plotting her next step. And I was right, because the very next day, something happened that proved the war wasn't quite over. In the next chapter, Marjorie takes her vendetta to a whole new level, and the neighborhood faces a dramatic twist no one saw coming. The night after the HOA meeting felt triumphant. The board had ruled in my favor, the playground stood tall in my backyard, and the neighborhood kids celebrated late into the evening with their parents cheering them on. Felt like the battle was won. But I underestimated just how far Marjorie was willing to go when she didn't get her way. The next morning, I noticed something unusual. My mailbox door was hanging open, even though I hadn't checked it yet. Inside was another letter, not from the HOA this time, but from the county zoning office. It claimed that someone had filed a complaint alleging that I was operating an unlicensed public park. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. My yard was clearly private property, and the playground was just for neighborhood children. But it was also clear who had filed the complaint. This wasn't about rules anymore. Marjorie had lost the HOA fight, so now she was trying to drag local authorities into it. By noon, a white SUV from the zoning office pulled up outside my house. An inspector stepped out, clipboard in hand, and began snapping photos. Parents walking by froze in their tracks. The children, who had been happily swinging and sliding, fell silent, watching with wide eyes as the official walked through my gate. The inspection itself was straightforward. He measured the equipment, checked that it wasn't blocking sidewalks or spilling into neighboring lots, and verified that it wasn't commercial property. I answered every question calmly, provided all my receipts and documentation, and explained that the playground was strictly private use. The inspector seemed satisfied, even amused, but he admitted he had to file a report because of the complaint. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. By afternoon, everyone knew Marjorie had escalated her crusade. Parents who had been hesitant before were now openly angry. Some talked about filing harassment complaints of their own. Others suggested starting a petition to remove her from the HOA board's advisory committee, where she had somehow embedded herself years ago. The street buzzed with whispered conversations and side glances at Marjorie's house, where the curtains stayed drawn tight all day. But Marjorie wasn't finished. 2 nights later, I caught her skulking around near my fence with her phone flashlight on, clearly trying to gather evidence. When I stepped outside, she scurried off, pretending to be out for a late walk. A neighbor across the street saw her too and recorded the whole thing. The footage showed her peeking through gaps in the fence, muttering to herself as she took photos of the playground. That was the breaking point for many people. It was no longer just a petty disagreement about children playing. It had become an obsession, a vendetta that was creeping into something darker. Parents worried about their kids' safety, not because of the playground, but because of the neighbor who seemed willing to stalk anyone who used it. The following weekend, I decided to turn the situation on its head. Instead of hiding from Marjorie's wrath, I leaned into the joy the playground brought. I organized a neighborhood play day, a barbecue, snacks, music, and an open invitation for every family on the block to join in. If Marjorie wanted to convince people that the playground was some kind of menace, I was going to show them it was the heart of the community. That Saturday afternoon, the cul-de-sac was alive with laughter. Kids raced from swing to slide to climbing wall. Parents chatted over grilled burgers and lemonade. Even residents without children came out, sitting on lawn chairs to watch the fun. The street, once subdued by fear of Marjorie's complaints, now pulsed with energy and unity. And there Marjorie was, standing on her porch with her arms crossed, fuming. She called someone, probably the zoning office again, and paced back and forth, glaring at the gathering. But this time no one cared. Her threats had lost their power. People waved cheerfully at her, as if to say, "We see you, and we're not afraid anymore." Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, the inspector from the county called to inform me that the case was closed. The complaint had no merit, the playground was perfectly legal, and no further action would be taken. I thanked him, hung up, and let the parents know. Cheers erupted. The kids kept playing until the last bit of daylight disappeared. But even in victory, I couldn't ignore the look Marjorie shot me as she disappeared into her house that night. It wasn't defeat. It was a promise that she wasn't done yet. And when I woke up the next morning to find graffiti sprayed on my back fence, angry words about selfish neighbors and noisy brats, I knew exactly whose hand was behind it, even if I couldn't prove it. The playground had brought the neighborhood together, but it had also pushed Marjorie over the edge. The next move she made would be her last, and it would force the entire community to finally confront her behavior once and for all. In the final chapter, Marjorie's obsession spirals out of control, leading to a dramatic confrontation and a resolution that changes the neighborhood forever. The morning after the grand unveiling of the playground, the neighborhood buzzed with energy. Parents walked their children past my yard just to catch a glimpse of the new structure. The laughter of kids echoed through the air, carrying farther than it ever had before. But amid the joy, there was a shadow hanging over the neighborhood. Everyone knew Karen would strike back. It wasn't a question of if, it was when. By midday, her response arrived. A crisp envelope bearing the HOA's seal landed in my mailbox. It was a formal notice citing alleged violations, unauthorized construction, excessive noise, and public nuisance. It was clear that Karen had gone straight to the HOA board and demanded action. She wanted the playground gone. Instead of panicking, I gathered every parent whose child had used my yard that weekend. One by one, they arrived on my driveway, anger simmering behind calm faces. Many of them had suffered Karen's meddling before. Complaints about lawn colors, holiday decorations, even where they parked their cars. This playground was different, though. It wasn't just about property. It was about their kids, their right to play, and their freedom from constant harassment. We agreed to fight. I documented every step of the playground installation. The permits I had secured from the city, the professional inspection to ensure safety, and the funding that came from community donations rather than any commercial sponsor. It was all perfectly legal, and I made sure the HOA board knew it. When the emergency HOA meeting took place, Karen arrived early, wearing the same smug expression she always wore when she thought victory was near. But as soon as the room filled with parents, she realized her usual tactics wouldn't work. One by one, the residents spoke, describing how Karen's endless complaints had disrupted their lives. Some had nearly moved away because of her harassment. Others shared how their children had been forced to stay indoors for fear of being yelled at for playing outside. Then it was my turn. I calmly explained that the playground met every local regulation, had passed every inspection, and existed entirely on my property. The HOA had no grounds to force its removal. I even presented a petition signed by almost every family in the neighborhood, praising the playground and demanding that it remain. The board deliberated quietly while Karen fumed. Her face turned red as she realized the power she thought she held was slipping away. In the end, the decision was unanimous. The HOA would take no action. The playground could stay. In fact, the board recommended that Karen refrain from harassing other residents, hinting that further complaints about children might result in disciplinary action against her. The news spread quickly. That afternoon, kids ran to my yard in droves, their laughter louder than ever, a victory song of freedom. Parents lingered on the sidewalks, talking and smiling in a way I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just about a playground anymore. It was about standing up to someone who had tried to control an entire community through fear. Karen retreated to her house, closing her blinds tightly. For the first time in years, she wasn't prowling the streets or shouting at children. She avoided eye contact with neighbors, clearly embarrassed that her attempt to wield power had backfired so publicly. As the sun set, the playground glowed in the golden light, and I watched the children climb, swing, and slide until their parents called them home for dinner. My yard wasn't just a yard anymore. It was a symbol of what happens when people refuse to be bullied. It was proof that even one person, standing firm with the support of a community, could stop someone from ruining the joy of childhood. In the weeks that followed, things changed. Neighbors who had barely spoken before started organizing block parties. Parents traded babysitting duties and looked out for each other's kids. The HOA, perhaps embarrassed by the public backlash, became more cooperative and less controlling. And Karen? She remained silent, her threats losing power the moment people stopped being afraid of them. Looking back, I realized that this wasn't just about a woman who hated kids playing outside. It was about reclaiming a neighborhood from unnecessary hostility. Where once there had been tension and whispered complaints, there was now laughter, connection, and community spirit. And every time I heard the squeak of the swings or the thump of little shoes racing across the playground, I smiled. Karen had threatened to call the HOA to take away a simple joy, but instead we had built something that no one could take away. One